Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar. Today, we're very excited to have Professor Zhang. Chenchen Zhan is an assistant professor in international relations at Durham University, and her current research is broadly related to global reactionary discourses and post-colonial nationalism in China. And she is co-editor of the journal Geopolitics and co-host of the Shita podcast. Today, she will be giving us a talk on post-colonial and nationalism and China. Okay, so welcome, Professor Zhang.
Thanks, Renin, for the introduction, and thanks, Marco, for inviting me to speak at this webinar. So today I want to talk about basically the construction of and renegotiation of East-West binaries from the kind of less studied side in conventional accounts of Orientalism, which is pretty much focused on deconstructing the Western gaze at the non-Western other, right? So I want to start with talking about Occidentalism and self-Orientalization in Chinese intellectual discourse. And then as a contemporary case study, I'll bring in my past and ongoing study of the anti-Baizuo discourse from both so-called anti-Western nationalists and so-called pro-Western dissidents, and how this unexpected convergence what does this tell us about their kind of co-constitutive relationship, as I understand it. So that's kind of the main part of this, the main empirical part of the talk. And then I will have some more fragmented comments on polarization and the mutual reinforcing of each other between the anti-Westernists and the pro-Westernists in digital culture. So Marco contacted me initially because
Oh, sorry, just 1 second. I think I've muted. Sorry, Chenchen, I think you're muted. Just 1 second.
Yeah, someone muted me. I just unmuted myself anyhow. You can hear me now?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So taking it as a starting point, I understand or approached post-colonial nationalism as production, consumption, and mobilization of narratives of national identity, capitalizing on victimhood or subordinity articulated through a colonial or post-colonial relationality to the side of the hegemonic. So it's really this expression of relationality that interests me. It sometimes takes the form of sameness. Sometimes it takes the form of difference by claiming to indigeneity. Sometimes it takes the form of autonomy by claiming to independence and autonomy, stuff like that. And all these different articulations of relationality are shaped by Orientalism and Occidentalism. But I want to add to these, of course, Orientalism has been studied massively in post-colonial literature, but I want to look at these concepts as global, transnational, and transversal fields of representation. So it's not a field of representation dominated by Western discourses only, and they take hybrid and contradictory forms. So I think existing research does not pay enough attention to how discourses emanating from the so-called non-West or post-colonial spaces also produce and negotiate East-West boundaries. And another thing is the so-called reverse ethnocentrism, okay, because we are interested in nationalism. A lot of it is about expressing kind of positive, let's say, attachment to a particular idea of a nation. But what I see in lots of these self-orientalizing discourses is some people might call self-hating, self-loathing, or reverse ethnocentrism, that rather than the opposite of nationalism, we might think of it as a particular form of nationalism, but which still remains understudied and under-theorized. So some notes on Occidentalism. People use the term in lots of different ways, so I just want to clarify how I use it. I'm referring to representations, basically imaginations of the West, that produce ideas of the West as a racial, civilizational, and geopolitical category, as well as its hierarchical relationship to the rest. So it's really not a reversal of Orientalism, but a part of it, constitutive of it. And both are embedded in the power structures that emerged out of the geopolitical dominance and also epistemic primacy of the West as the universal and the rest, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indian, whatever, as a particular. There are some kind of very important books in this literature, which even though it's quite small compared to the literature on Orientalism. So some books, for example, by Bonnet and Aydin, they argued that it was really intellectuals in what modernizing intellectuals in Japan and Turkey in the 19th century that invented the idea of the West, defined by a by now familiar set of characteristics such as modern, secular, productive, scientific, rational, and all this stuff we assign to the West as a civilizational category, as opposed to some other categories as religious, traditional, irrational, emotional, whatever. So they argue that it first emerged as a major theme in these intellectual debates in Japan, Turkey, places like Japan, Turkey, but also in China, in Russia as well. And I want to emphasize that Occidentalism and its co-constitutive other, that's self-orientalization, in post-colonial nationalism are strategic. They are historically contingent. They are embedded in specific political projects. So in the 19th century and early 20th century, in places like China, like Japan, a lot of it had to do with modernization, with nation building, with countering Western imperialism, even though in some cases, like in Japan, it led to its own brand of imperialism and colonialism targeting Asian nations. So this is a chart that summarizes these competing essentialisms and Chinese narratives of East and West binaries, but I think it also applies to other geographies as well. So you have, of course, negative portrayal of the East as self-narrative, as backward, uncivilized, authoritarian, and people like to use these words, slave mentality or 奴性, to describe the kind of innate backwardness of Chinese culture. And by contrast, then the West is represented as civilized, democratic, adventurous, independent, individualistic, scientific, and so on. So, but these value judgments are subjective. Certain traits like individualism, it can be judged as positive in some stories, but negative in other stories. So the value judgment is quite fluid. And in terms of self-orientalization, I think we can distinguish between the celebratory strand and the self-depreciating strand. The celebratory strand, Syrian scholar Alas used the concept of Orientalism in reverse in his discussion of Arab nationalism. So that's pretty much, it's quite similar to the Pan-Asianism in the early 20th century. So places like Asia or construct like the Arab nation is you have this discourse about their essence, being spiritual, being humanist, as opposed to the materialist Western civilizations. You have a lot of these essentialist binaries during that period of time. But I want to say that these scripts change. They are not fixed. They are not static. They are strategic. So by the late 20th century, in the 1990s, we see a different kind of self-celebratory Orientalism in the Asian values discourse. So the background now is the admirable economic success of some East Asian and Southeast Asian countries. So you have this new discourse that's about Asians being community oriented, disciplined, highly productive, and hardworking. This discourse, so it has been produced by both Asian actors, let's say, and also Western actors. In Western discourse, you have Berger has called the yellow mythologies in place of or reinforcing an earlier version of yellow perils about Asian economic success. So both sides, people from both sides, are using this new Orientalist thing, but from different geopolitical perspective, for different purposes. For authoritarian leaders in Asia, for example, they use the Asian values discourse to justify particular political and economic arrangements and to consolidate their power. Whereas in Western discourses, it's about really reflecting and invoking anxieties about Western decline and the threat of a rising Asia. Arif Durik, I think, offered one of the most pertinent critiques of Asian values as a hegemonic discourse within Asia. So he said that in the very process, it consolidates Western ideological hegemony by internalizing the historical assumptions of Orientalism. At the same time, it contributes to internal hegemony by suppressing differences within the nation. And then I have the more interesting, what I think more interesting strand, which is the self-depreciating version of self-Orientalism. So this is about reifying fantasies of the West and what is perceived as defining it, such as Christianity and whiteness. And then against this fantasy of the civilized West, you construct the innate backwardness of the self. In China, it's reflected in this popular and enduring discourse about national characters, 国民性. They like to say the Chinese national character is defined by conservatism, authoritarianism, slave mentality, stuff like that. And you see that in some best-selling books such as Ugly Chinaman and a book called I Don't Want to Be Chinese Again. And these in these narratives, you have strategic essentialism that were used for historically specific projects. For example, I mentioned nation building and counter imperialism in the May 4th movement at the beginning of the 20th century. And then it's used to critique Chinese authoritarian rule and Chinese Communist Party in the pro-democracy movement in the 1980s. So some commentators do think of it kind of positively, so they can see that there is a constructive aspect to these criticisms, even though sometimes they amount to a form of self-racialization. But others are more critical Tony Barlow, for example, she wrote that this is really intellectuals who constitute their identity as modern, as Western, as enlightened subjects against the close-minded, backward, and ignorant masses they look down upon. So it's kind of internal power relations within the let's say the Orientalized place. So I think this is quite a very prominent theme in Chinese intellectual discourse, but it's not unique. You also see kind of similar parallels in Russia, in Meiji Japan. There were those also similar portrayal narratives of backwardness and inferiority. And Ahiska also discusses some aspects of it in Turkish Occidentalism. So some more examples. In the 1980s, there was this famous documentary called River Elegy. It kind of filled the liberal, pro-democratic zeitgeist during that time. As we know, it eventually led to the student protests, and that was brutally suppressed in the 1918 massacre in Beijing. But before that, there were lots of these pro-democratic intellectual debates, and this documentary is part of it. But there are also very problematic aspects to the documentary. It was basically, again, using these racial civilizational hierarchies, depicting the adventurous blue civilization that basically means Europe and America, so the West, that brought science and democracy to the world, like erasing colonial violence from it, and the closed-minded yellow civilization, meaning China, trapped by ignorance and backwardness. So that documentary itself is already very, very critical and self-orientalizing. But the late Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo was not even satisfied with that already very self-orientalizing narrative, and he said that River Elegy's hidden meaning is still that China is a great nation, which it isn't. And 99% of the Chinese are just weak and shriveled and listless and stuff like that. So it does remind one of the comments made by Tony Barlow, whether there is a kind of construction of intellectual subjectivity against the close-minded, backward, ignorant masses in their imagination. So that was in the 1980s, when China was indeed economically very, very underdeveloped. So people use this sort of kind of culturalistic explanation to explain economic underdevelopment, which is understandable. But this is still very enduring in pro-Western distant discourse even now, in contemporary times. So I'm quoting this, for example, this speech made by a prominent free market Austrian school economist, Zhang Weiying. He made a speech at Peking University's, the nation's most prestigious university, its graduation ceremony in 2017, where he said China has made zero contribution to the progress of human civilization in the past 500 years. We have made great achievements in economic growth in the past 30 years, but it's entirely based on the innovation of the Western world in the past 300 years. And then he said that the reasons for that is the Chinese people lack freedom and creativity. So in a way, you can say that's a critique of the political system, but still there are lots of very problematic aspects to that argument, and you can imagine that this will invite a huge nationalist backlash that has been ongoing against the stigmatized public intellectuals in Chinese public discourse, because for the nationalists, you can easily see that they will argue that the public intellectuals are so pro-Western and they have this very distorted image of Western superiority over the rest of the world. Now I'm going to the next topic that on the surface looks very different from what I've been talking about previously. But you will see why it's connected in a minute. So I want to talk about global reactionary discourses, something I touched upon in the Global Right paper as well. So to me, reactionary discursive formations at the current historical conjuncture coalesce around these two sorts of narrative structures. One is self-victimizing articulations of racism and racial nationalism. Another is rejection of social justice struggles. And this often involves using terms like culture wars, identity politics, woke, political correctness, and so on. These are typically delegitimized as elitist in the West, or delegitimated as Western in the global East and South. So I think these are the core grammars of contemporary reactionary discursive formations. You see lots of other words like populism, which I think is a distraction. I'm also guilty of using populism in my past work, but I now regret that. I don't want to use populism as I don't think it's a useful framework anymore. And the reason why I'm using reactionary rather than right and left is also because you see these attacks on social justice struggles mostly from the right, but also from the left to some extent. So these discursive formations really operate across political spectrum. Now, if we talk about reaction, we have to answer the question, this is reaction to what? So at least three things at work here. The first thing is historically specific forms of anti-racist feminist decolonial movements in the past few decades. So the reaction is very much against that. The reaction is also against the globalization of human rights politics. This is from the South and the East, something I touched upon again in the Global Right paper. So it's almost like conservative forces in post-colonial spaces are reacting to what they can see, what they think of as expressions of liberal hegemony in human rights politics, and also reaction to changing economic power relations, the decline of the West's economic power, basically, in the international political economy. So you have these renewed narratives of civilizational decline. Civilizational decline and decay is, of course, a classic theme in conservative thought. But at the current conjuncture, in these renewed imaginations, you have the image of an emasculated, overly multiracial, and overly self-critical West, according to these far-right conservative commentators, such as Douglas Murray, who's very famous on Twitter recently, don't know why, due to immigration and leftist ideologies that negate, quote and unquote, the West's own values. And at the same time, of course, they express nostalgia towards a past that's supposed to be racially pure and socially, politically masculine. But this has been written a lot in far-right studies, but less attention is paid to how these narratives also enable reactionary politics elsewhere. So that's where that Occidentalism concept becomes relevant. So, for example, you see the image of the Swedish dystopia. Some researchers of the far right have written about, and they see that it's been instrumental in many other different nations in Europe and in the US outside of Sweden. So how Sweden is being destroyed again by immigrants on one hand and a leftist political culture that favors immigrants on the other. And you see these narratives are being used. So this particular reactionary imagination of the West is used to bolster racial nationalism in China and South Korea. A quote I cited in my 2020 paper, for example, they say the Baizu, the white left, I'll get to that later, have turned the beautiful and affluent Sweden into notorious rape capital. So both dystopian and utopian, beautiful and affluent, because it's somewhat representing a pure whiteness, as Åkerlund also wrote in her paper on dystopian utopia. So Sheik wrote about how the South Korean anti-refugee sentiments were also recycling European narratives or invoking particular images of Europe. And Indian men's rights movements, they would invoke an image of the West as being kind of destroyed by feminists and stuff like that. So why it's useful? It's useful in multiple ways. So here I'm citing a quote from Balovan, who I believe also spoke at this webinar series in the past. So he wrote that the West is increasingly invoked as a solitary tale. So it's invoked as a cautionary tale. That's one use. That's one way that's useful. It's also useful because you can, for those who are opposed or not happy with Western dominance, you could label certain values, certain movements like feminism as Western, as a way of discrediting it. And relatedly, you have these contrasts emerging between an emasculated postmodern West and adequately masculine, adequately non-woke, authoritarian, and or conservative Easts. So these contrasts are used by actors from both sides. Again, but the geopolitical mechanism is different. For actors identified with the West, this reflects and mobilize anxieties about Western decline and Eastern threats, especially with regard to China. I'll give some examples later. And for the non-West, then these contrasts or renewed imaginations of East-West binaries can channel revanchist national pride. And again, they use it as a cautionary tale, and they use it to discredit social justice movements and feminism as Western and therefore illegitimate. Right, I have 10 minutes left. So I've written about the anti-Baizu discourse on Chinese social media from the Nationalists. Baizu or white left is a rhetorical device that has very similar meaning as social justice warrior or wokerati, whatever, in Anglophone alt-right vocabulary, but it's more explicitly visualized, and this invocation of whiteness does lots of work. I won't go into details here, but I touched upon this in my past papers. So I wrote about the nationalists. But what's quite interesting here is it's also produced by the anti-CCP pro-Western dissidents. One paper on this is a friend of mine, Yao Lin's paper that's called Beaconism, a paper about Beaconism. So that's very, very similar to what I said about Occidentalism. So on the surface, it may look surprising, but in the end, if you come down from that route of that trajectory of Occidentalism that has always idealized the West as something that's based on, defined by whiteness Christianity and devoid of colonial violence, then it's also not so surprising that you would end up reproducing these reactionary discourses. So for the nationalists, this is overlapped with concurrent rise of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and misogyny on social media. For the Trumpists, the self-styled Trumpist dissidents, as I said, there's a continuation with earlier narratives of Occidentalism, but also there's also a pragmatic value in teaming up with the U.S. far right. So I used a picture of anti-CCP activist and businessman Guo Wengui. He teamed up with Steve Bannon. Despite the U.S. far right's blatant anti-Chinese racism, but they have made like kind of strategic alliances due to their common interest in opposing the CCP. So though it may look peculiar, but it's also not unique, I've read that you have a similar pattern among supporters and critics of the Russian regime. So they also converge in embracing anti-racist and anti-woke discourses. I have lots of slides about global racial entanglements, which I'm not going to go through because it's from a different paper about race and gender in global reactionary discourses. So more relevant to this talk is, as I said, these renewed gendered binaries between China and the West produced in the anti-Baizuo discourse, where you have a series of gendered hierarchies. For example, welfare states is feminized, competitive market economy is masculinized, the environment is feminized, industrialization is masculinized, humanities as a field is feminized, and STEM fields is masculinized. And all these come to be used to saturate the contrast between an emasculated West and an adequately masculine China. So China, in this particular techno-nationalist discourse, is associated with competition or competitive mindsets, punitive justice, a doer not a talker, described as straight men mentality, and STEM fields, homogeneity, whereas the West is associated with feminized welfare state, egalitarianism, overly lenient restorative justice system, activism, humanities as academic discipline, and diversity. So you see like similar invocation of similar binaries in the Anglophone alt-right circle as well. So for example, here you see this meme from the meme from alt-right's Twitter, where the again talk about how the Chinese are focused on STEM, science and technology, and not doing woke social justice things. Richard Spencer, who's the guy who coined the term the alt-right, he said that China is a unified racial state. The fantasy of China is a unified racial state, and he also said somewhere else that China is a state run by engineers, very much in agreement with the Zhihu internet users I surveyed here. But the geopolitical dynamics or mechanism is different, right? Here in the US far right discourse, China is a permanent enemy. And it's also a fantasy. It's a fantasy because it's an enemy. The fantasy part and the enemy part is mutually reinforcing. It is a threat precisely because it's doing all these right things on the social justice and anti-social justice front. Another thing is how the techno-nationalists, they did not break with, but reinvent the Occidentalist discourse in intellectual history by assigning the stuff that used to be assigned to the West to China now. So it's still very, very Eurocentric logics. If you remember in the beginning of the 20th century, words or traits such as material, industrial, rational, independent, science, computation, all these were assigned to the West, but now they are assigned to designated to the idea of China in this discourse. So in a nutshell, I find this expression from Linder's book, Prototype Nation, very useful, very fitting. So their argument is that China has outwested the West due to its commitment to techno-economic progress, but continues to be marginalized in a liberal international order. So quickly on the dissidents. The dissidents, as I commented earlier, even though this reactionary turn is not inevitable, so many of them have openly endorsed Trumpism, and some of them teamed up with the US far right due to pragmatic concerns, common interest in opposing the CCP. But I think the pragmatic alliance is at least in part based on ideological affinities. And you can see that from the more theoretical academic writings I analyzed in the paper. So ultimately, the images of the West that some have deployed to debate domestic conditions are based on internalized racial civilizational hierarchy and erasure of colonial violence. 2 minutes left. I think I'll just go in. Right. Just very quickly on another difference. I do see lots of similarities, commonalities between the nationalists and the dissidents, especially how they are both producing this and attacking this image of the emasculated West undermined by non-white immigration and so-called woke ideologies. But they also both have a nostalgia for the past. But this past, this Gloria past, for the techno-nationalists, is associated with material power, military strength, aggressiveness. So this is something they want to learn from. They appreciate. So even though for the nationalists, it's mostly a kind of Schadenfreude feeling that the West is in decline, but there's also a lamentation that, wow, that they used to be very, very powerful, and they do appreciate that material power in the past. And for the dissidents, the past is defined by white Christianity, individualism, and free market economy. And of course, also both, in both cases, is defined by racial pureness. I have this big table that's trying to map everything in representations of the West and China in the US far right, Chinese right wing nationalist, and Chinese right wing dissident discourses. And there are overlaps and there are divergences and there are different mechanisms of mediating between the international and the domestic. So I'll go quickly to the conclusion. So what I'm trying to do here is to show that powerful binaries such as East, West, civilized, and barbarian are constructed, acted upon, and also deployed as a resource to legitimate particular political projects. And they are produced also by actors from the other side of these dichotomies that are less studied. But at the same time, these dualistic constructs are highly unstable, highly mutable, and messy and chaotic. They are being deconstructed and reconstructed in the present moment against the background of changing power relations. So the anti-Western nationalists use discontent with Western hegemony and liberal hierarchy to defend authoritarianism, racial nationalism, social conservatism, even though they actually use the same, reproduce the narratives used by the Western far right. And then you have the pro-Western dissidents who criticize Chinese authoritarianism through reinforcing hierarchical binaries. And they also share certain assumptions with the nationalists. And this approach also feed into the nationalists' approach because the nationalists are using this discontent with assumed Western superiority for their own projects. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chenchen.